behalf of Nalsar and the Techlog Forum at Nalsar, it is my great pleasure to welcome Mr. Apar Gupta, Mr. Raman Chima, and Mr. Kiran Jolala-Katra. They are the trustees of the Internet Freedom Foundation, and they are some of the foremost minds in this field of technology law. Mr. Apar Gupta is a practicing advocate in the High Court and the Supreme Court. Mr. Raman Chima is a policy analyst, and he is also the director of Access Now in this region. And Mr. Kiran is a programmer and one of the greatest minds in the programming side. So, without further ado, to the speakers.
Just check if you can hear me.
No, we don't put them on air.
I can do that.
Yeah, that's easier for the recording also.
First request, so I've been asked to play chaperone, which is an appropriate description. The second ask is that come closer. Kiran said this, and we're going to enforce this. We will not talk until people come closer, because I know everyone avoids the front bench. Come closer, they're comfortable sofas. People should move there. Chauhan, you get to come.
Yeah, those benches are for the sofas. I'm sorry. That sofa is generally meant for judges, so yeah.
That is fine. You
will not fall asleep, so it's alright.
Yeah, you keep your active. Come. Also, if you're closer, it'll be easier for you to grab stickers. We have lots of IFF stickers. And yes, they will run out though, so if you're closer, it's better. With that, I'll just talk a bit about us, and we're going to break off some of it. We're going to try and keep it across all three of us. So just in terms of logistics, will you be able to hear if they're talking more, right?
Yeah, we can put on, but it's easier if you speak from there.
Okay, fine.
Okay.
So first, what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about ourselves, and then they'll try to give explanation to you about where they've come from and what IFF is about, because it's all linked together. There's a reason why all three of us, want to work. None of us, in fact, we've been friends, but none of us actually went to the same institution together or worked together. We've all known each other at different points of time. Just by way of brief introduction, we're 3 of 8 trustees at the Internet Freedom Foundation right now. We're 8, right, or 7? We're 8. We are 8 trustees spread across mostly Delhi and Bangalore, but there are lots of other people as well, and we'll give you a little bit of background about where we came from. Individually, just about ourselves, so you heard the brief introductions. I'm a law and policy person. Apar is a lawyer. You might have read many of his writings, as well as he actively litigates. Some of you may have worked with him or know of his practice. Kiran is I would say, technologist, which is a poor description of the range of things he's done. He also runs ASGeek, helped set it up, which is India's best developer networks. If you've ever done coding or built things or tried to talk to people who build things, you may have heard of ASGeek. With that, maybe we'll do this brief introductions about ourselves a bit further. So maybe we'll start from there. Apar, do you want to do that?
Just to add to what Raman has said about 5 to 6 years back, I had the opportunity to work on a case which is called Share Union of India. Prior to that, I worked on policy advisories, and part of my work is split across advising internet companies, media companies in this space. And a lot of it is now also public interest advocacy oriented. Also, immediately after the Shreya Singhal judgment happened, there were signs that network neutrality will become quite a big issue in India. And I think a person who connected a lot of us was Nikhil Pava, who's a journalist who runs the Medianama platform. So he reached out to all of us. We knew each other from the space, and this was the basis on which, say, the internet was forged. What I'm doing at present I run my law offices, and it's essentially catering to private clients, and about 20 to 30% of my time goes towards public interest civil rights causes. So I'm challenging the beef ban in the High Court of Delhi, in which criminal possession of beef is illegal in Delhi, and also there is a reverse onus of presumption for mere possession of meat, which may be beef. I am part of the team of lawyers which are challenging the Aadhaar project in the Supreme Court of India. Besides these two, I also put in some time towards the public advocacy of these issues. Of course, this is a little removed from the wider range of work which I am supporting at the Internet Freedom Foundation, and we'll talk a lot more in detail about it as we progress through the talk. Thanks.
I'm Kiran. I'm a programmer, but I'm also a self-taught programmer in that I did not do this formally at university. It's something I just did as a hobby at home much before I was at university level. And so one of the things I've been doing most of my working life is to say, rather than working in the formal software economy, what can I do that's on the fringes, and say, what are other sectors that need programming support, need technology support, and haven't quite figured it out. So for some time, I was a journalist writing for a computer magazine. Later on, I went on to build a website and launched one of the earliest news websites in India back in '99. For a while, I worked with a university that was doing bioinformatics, helping build a database of human proteins to understand how diseases are caused, how you can understand academic research versus medical practice, make those connections and so on. For a while, I was curious about how governance in India works, so I ended up working for the government in Karnataka, deploying rural telecenters, working on the food and civil supplies programs, their modernization, computerization, and so on. And one of the things that we did at that point, in a way to essentially cut down on graft and cut down on leakage, ended up becoming the blueprint of Aadhaar. I obviously have not worked on Aadhaar itself, it's just that I was on the predecessor, So we saw what was going to come before it happened. And we saw fairly early warning signs of a bunch of issues, plus obviously fairly obvious ideas about the benefits, which is why a project like that even stands to exist today. And one of the things I learned over many years of working on the fringes of tech plus other businesses, other interests, is that technology is fairly poorly understood in these zones. So when you start working with an academic institution, they do not understand what programmers are and how they think, what the institutional structures of technology are. Same thing happens in journalism, same thing happens when you're working in government. Everybody sees technology as a very alien thing that they don't understand how it works. They assume that if you pay a programmer to build something, he will build it, and that's the end of it. It doesn't work like that. You can't just make up things from your imagination. You need to build it on top of foundations. The foundations may or may not allow you to build what you want to do. In a way, this is fairly similar to how law works. You can't simply say, why can't the law be like this, and make it. Like, this does not happen. You always work on the foundation that you're inheriting, because the foundations are far more complex than any individual can deal with and say, let me reimagine all of this by myself. That doesn't happen. It's the same in technology. You cannot reimagine things by yourself. It's a fairly complicated field. So one of the things I learned in the process was that people do not appreciate the institutional complexities of working in technology, which is essentially why we keep wondering why technology projects don't work out the way we thought they should work out. And so one of the things I've been doing for the last 6 years is to say, how can I help the technology community itself understand its own institutional structures and mechanisms and processes and be better coordinated. Not the software industry, but people who work in the industry. Because people who work in the industry are subject by rules that the industry itself may not be interested in. So that's basically what HasGeek is. It's a place to come out and talk about how things work in tech and what everybody's up to and how you can learn from each other.
You heard a bit about me at the start, but just to go over it, I'm a lawyer by training. The other way I describe myself is I'd say I'm a junior of Professor Chauhan. I get to say that. We were seeing many things in technology law and policy at the National Law School where I studied. I went straight after that and I worked in industry. I worked for 5 years in Google's public policy team, looking at public policy and government affairs. coordinating most of the work happening for Google in South Asia, and build on a bit of what Kiran says, that when you work with engineers, you get a better sense of the issues that they face, but also how products and technology is built, which is not clear-cut, it's not command control. And also engineers often then understand how law works, which is not always simple, and especially when you look at policy. And I always encourage law students to think about this. Policy is law, because law comes out of political discussions and policy imperatives, and it's not simple. It's compromises, sometimes those compromises are good things, you figure those out. But I was at Google for 5 years till the end of 2014. I left after that. I joined my current organization, which is Access Now. It's an international not-for-profit with offices spread across the world, but mostly split between New York, Washington DC, Brussels, and technology offices in Costa Rica, Tunis, and elsewhere. I lead the global public policy team there, which means I manage around 8 to 10 people working on public policy in the digital rights space across these countries. What did often draw many of us together, and just to go back to that, is actually the Shreya Singhal case, and you may have heard of it. And there are many things that can be talked about Shreya Singhal, but I'm just curious, how many years do you think the case went on for? 3 years, right? 3 years. In reality, the battle for it took actually 8 to 9 years. So Shreya Singhal is a great example of a case where there's a lot of stuff written before that. You may see some of it. There was the amendment of the Information Technology Act. That is before the 26/11 attacks in Bombay. After the attacks happened, the discussion got jumped up in Parliament, and it was one of the bills that was passed along with 9 other bills in 3 minutes with a voice vote in Parliament. The fun fact, and there are many fun facts here in this talk, the fun fact was that technically MPs did not see what they passed. So the version of the bill they passed was what they saw before, and the version that was passed that day were different versions. And there's actually a record in Parliament where you can see the minister moves a motion saying, please did so-and-so thing be renumbered to reflect the paper physically shared with MPs right before they walked into the House versus what's on the table of the House. So these are the messy politics that drive our stuff there. But why I mention this is that it took 8 to 9 years to finally challenge that, finally have a debate that went to the Supreme Court. There were many challenges. People filed across high courts in the country, lots of debates in Parliament and elsewhere. For example, the Shreya Singhal case builds on at least 2 debates in the Rajya Sabha, including a push by members of Parliament to challenge certain rules as well. People being arrested in that discussion there. It is a fantastic outcome, but it's an outcome built on a lot of work. And many of the people involved in that, both in the law and policy space, as well as people looking at this in the technology space, said, let's do better. It's now, the issues become more mainstream. And that's in a sense also the story a bit about the Save the Internet campaign and the Internet Freedom Foundation. The favorite origin story for this is given by our colleague Nikhil Pava, who Apar mentioned. So, and Nikhil describes it quite well, and with permission, I'll also use the exact language he used. He looked at the consultation paper that the telecom regulator issued in March of 2015, which was fairly longly titled. It was a consultation paper for issues relating to over-the-top services in India, OTT services, which is a technical telecom term. If you de-jargon it, it basically means the internet, because all internet services or applications are over-the-top services. Nikhil described this quite graphically, saying that read the paper, many other people read the paper, and the common expression many of them had if they worked in the internet sector or if they cared about the internet was, oh shit, what the hell is this? This is awful, because what the regulator is proposing in 140 pages of badly written language in that particular paper was that it distrusted internet services. It said many of these seem to have raised privacy concerns and national security concerns that require new regulation. It looked at the subject of net neutrality, which I can unpack for many people, but in a simple way means that telecom operators should not act as gatekeepers over content. It said they're skeptical about the idea, despite the fact that TRAI over several years before that had said that we want to engage in that subject in India, and basically seemed to articulate a position where telecom lobbyists had given them content to produce. And I'm being upfront and direct in this audience because you can see the difference between TRAI then and TRAI now. There were footnotes there that were taken from position papers written by industry, put out there, and seemed like this is a rubber stamp. It's going to go ahead. Telecom lobbyists on average meet the telecom regulator every week. I work in the tech sector, so I can share the tech sector would perhaps meet people in the TRA or the DOT maybe every month, month and a half, some bigger players more actively. Telecom industry officials would be there every 2 days, if not more. Some of them, as a joke, you could see them parked in the lobby to the Department telecoms, Sanchar Bhavan in Delhi all the time. But what the reaction that triggered was this effort, not just amongst people in Delhi, in fact often responding to people in Bangalore and Hyderabad saying, we want to make a difference, we want to file in that. And we'll talk a bit about that there. What that resulted finally is that figure. So, and I'm sure many of you might be familiar with this. The SaveTheInternet.in website essentially tracked 1.2 million submissions that were filed to the TRAI. I can speak with a reasonable amount of authority that, at least till that point of time, that is the largest number of inputs received in a public consultation in India's history, probably beating some of the land consultations you also see, which often result in probably 80 lakh or whatever, but never cross that number. And it was also important because what is normally a space only of lobbyists, only of lawyers, specialists, or big company CEOs became something everyone wrote in. One of my favorite statistics, fun facts is, visit a website called overthetop.in. It is an open data website produced by a couple of engineers who looked at the database of the submissions made to TRAI and extracted by the domains and who sent it. My fun thing was the number of people who from government email addresses sent submissions to TRAI, the number of people from big companies, including Facebook, including Google and others, who directly sent submissions to TRAI. So it became a mass movement. And why I mention this is that when people talked about 66A and the case, they said, look at what Parliament has passed, Parliament doesn't care about us. People now want to act up and they use the process for that. I want to pause here a bit to let me get just to explain that why did people get interested in it, why did people donate time. There was one thing I can share with the Save the Internet platform. And the website was we had 60 people, 70 people volunteering across the country, lots of techies, and no one was paid. They all did it free.
Yeah. So it ended up being almost 100 volunteers, and one of the ways you recruit people obviously is by reputation. You know, and say, if for instance Nikhil, who was the originator of the campaign, essentially called me and said, I need a website, can you build something? He called Raman and Apar and said, look, I need help with the legal aspects, can you do something? He called AB and said, can you guys produce a video? So recruitment happens in this manner, that one person says, look, I want support, I don't know the industry, but I know one person in the industry who trusts me, can they in turn recruit other people? And that's what I did. That I did not actually build the website, I did none of the technology work, because I was just extremely busy with work at that point. But I made a commitment to say, look, I will make this happen. You know, that you will have a website, I will ensure it happens, I'm going to find somebody to do it for you, and I will watch over them and make it happen. And so I started asking my friends. I had an intern, I asked him to do it. The intern is now one of the trustees of IFF because he did a fantastic job of starting off the location and building for what was required. I also had a bunch of friends come in. One friend became yet another trustee of IFF. Another friend happened to be busy running a jute factory while he was building the website. And most people may not realize this, but one of the aspects of our campaign was a letter from startups to the PM. The fellow who drafted the letter runs a jute factory in Calcutta. Okay? You would not expect that this is someone who would come in and write on behalf of startups and have 100 startups or 1,000 startups endorse it. But the fact is that these things are possible because there are people who are clued in to an industry even if they do not actively participate in it because of other life causes. And it comes down to how you recruit them and say, this is your chance, participate. Okay? What is the basis on which you give them a platform to participate and what is the participation supposed to be? So if you start with something like saying, we need to run a campaign, participate, that does not help. Nobody knows what to do when you provide something as broad as that. If you say, we don't like the fact that various police departments shut down the internet in India, let us stop it. What is an average person supposed to do? Are you going to write an angry letter to the PM? What's going to happen? The PM does not control internet shutdowns because it's a state issue. So when you do this, you need to essentially break it down and see you've got a larger goal, you think these are the components. As you break it further and further down, find a well-defined area in which somebody else can participate and come up with it. So Nikhil called me and said, look, we need a website in which we can send email to try. And he had an idea about how it was to be done. I came in and said, look, I know something more about how to send email. I think the approach you have is wrong. I have a better idea, which is a bit of a technical challenge, but I know how to explore it. So I'm going to find the next person and say, I have this very specific problem that I think you can solve in a certain manner, but you need to try it and find out if it works. And so that became the next person's challenge. It became a very well-defined task saying, please see if a certain approach to sending an email works. it has nothing to do with the campaign at this point when you give a task like this to someone. It's just about saying, here's a technology problem, can you solve it? So what we effectively did was created this chain of breakdowns where one person says, I'm responsible for the larger thing, I have an idea for something smaller that is a piece of the larger thing, can I find somebody else to take responsibility for it and deliver only that piece? So, and the other thing obviously when this happens is your communication structure becomes a bottleneck. Because if Apar has a question about, hey, will this website have a certain feature, and he's going to ask me, or he's going to ask Nikhil, Nikhil is going to ask me, I'm going to say, look, I'm not actually building the website, somebody else is, I'm going to ask the next person. Now this chain of communications is typically where a campaign breaks down. Because if you have distributed expertise, you need the ability to say anybody can jump into a conversation with anybody who's involved. As long as everybody knows what they are responsible for and everybody else knows what you are responsible for, can they talk to you directly? So one of the things that helped the campaign was fixing our communication problems. And so we figured we just go and put everybody in the chat room and just go for it. So by fixing these things, how to set up an organization that coordinates itself properly, we got to the point of building something that ended up having so much momentum when it went live.
And the thing there was that we saw the value, right? We also saw that you need to shape, be able to put in inputs, put in commentary to the government, be able to talk about it in a credible way, in a respectful way. We also tried to not say that, okay, look, we know everything. We gave a template tool which allowed you to customize it, so individual users could change or alter that, and I'm sure many of you may have done that. And what we also tried to do was understand that people also need further solutions, so they need to see democratic engagement. And democracy often is about, by the way, who shouts or who votes. And then it's about, okay, how do we craft a solution? And we try to provide that as well. And these are policy recommendations. Here is the expert submission we're providing as well. Here are experts who have provided comments, as Kiran mentioned, startups and others, but even academics. For example, we used the terminology prepared by a fantastic Columbia academic of Indian origin, Indian citizen, but still Vishal Mishra, who looked at the economic and network discrimination issues. And he said, look, I may be a free market person, but I do believe regulation is a critical role in making a free market work. And more particularly, democracy is even more important. So we came to it from that, and we had something that was finally a good outcome, in the sense that what TRA did on the issue of zero rating was issue good, strong regulations. I think what we're actually particularly proud of is not just the regulations. I personally think I'm proud of the memo, and that sounds like a boring thing, right? But normally TRA recommendations, if you ever read them in India, are around their recommendations or their regulations or rules. In this case, they were regulations. Normally they're like between 4 to 10-page regulations, with a 1-page, 2-page standard issue government press release and a few other lines there that go to the Press Trust of India. TRA put out an 8-page memorandum explaining why they issue these regulations and justification for that. Fun fact, that quotes Supreme Court case law. It says that telecommunications regulation in this country must come from the fact that we all have Article 19 1A rights. The government is saying this. We all have Article 19 1A rights, and the government must act as stewards of that. And that if you don't take this action, the net's ability to provide free speech power to everyone will be undermined. This is a year or so after the Shreya Singhal ruling, where the Attorney General for the Union and the Additional Solicitor General for the Union was arguing, we believe in free speech, but we believe in fact, the internet makes it more important to even more tightly regulate it. To a situation where at least one government agency is saying, our test is in fact going to be, do we protect your free speech rights on the web? It's momentum. It is getting it out there in the public discourse. That is one trigger for us to say that, look, we need to keep doing this. A, because by the way, net neutrality isn't over. That regulation actually was a specific subject on zero rating, namely, can certain providers zero rate your mobile data? India does not still have binding net neutrality regulations and everything else. Why I mentioned this is it's not academic. Bharti Airtel and other companies have said they will block your access to certain services because they think you should perhaps pay more for them. So 2.5 years ago, Bharti Airtel said they would block access to VoIP services in this country unless you paid a special VoIP tariff rate. Fun fact, again, for those of you who follow telecom law, chapter 9 of the Unified Service License, I expect no one to know this chapter and verse because I hope you don't. I hope you have not read the telecom licenses. You will live longer as a result of that. But chapter 9 of the telecom license actually specifically says you can't do that. It creates a general principle saying that you should not discriminate on the basis of content. But it did not stop Bharti Airtel from announcing that. It did not stop the head of the industry's lobby group, the Cellular Operators Association of India, which represents all the GSM telecom companies in India, to say that the law is not clear enough on this. And by the way, these aren't empty comments. When industry says this, they believe it, they've tested it, and they feel reasonably confident about saying it. So what I say is this is an example of regulatory failure. Because you have a rule, the rule is not affecting firm behavior, what economists would say, and therefore the government needs to decide what its next step is. Which is why we have been saying, like many other countries, India needs binding net neutrality rules that are enforced either by regulation or by statute, or should be there. That's why they have not been there. The government's worked on it for a year and a half. That consultation process is on right now. Exactly one day before the deadline, TRI has given another month of comments, time for comments. Those are due now mid-March to end of March. But going back to what we talked about, we said after this campaign you need someone permanently here. You need someone who can say, look, we do activism, we build things, we want to be able to represent users of this country. And it's not just about net neutrality. So how many of you use WhatsApp? Everyone, right? How many of you heard of Signal? Use Signal? Or not? Two. How many more? 2, 3 others. It's an encrypted communication app. So just to break it down, Signal is run by a company called Open Whisper Systems, which have licensed their technology to WhatsApp. You may have noticed a couple of months ago that you got a message saying your service is encrypted. And won't go to what is encryption. Encryption is coding. Many of you probably know that, but what people often forget is that encryption is often subject to government debate and challenge, because surprise, surprise, spy agencies who develop a lot of encryption themselves don't like other people using it. That's not just a thing in India. The US had acted debating in the late 90s. In India, they put out an encryption policy document last year for comments, which people looked at and were horrified, because anyone who develops cryptology was deeply concerned that it created backdoors. So what would be created as a backdoor for spy agencies could be used by hackers easily. It created things that would break encryption. You would be often required to keep keys or do other things which didn't make sense. That policy document was withdrawn after 2 days of public comment and criticism. 2 fun facts. One fun fact, we got how many encryption queries? I remember Karthik was saying like I think he got every day asked what is Save the Internet audience position on encryption.
Yeah, I don't remember.
So they all kept and said, what is Save the Internet audience position on encryption? And people said, do we need to have a position on encryption? And they were saying, yeah, you guys need to. Again, because why people saw us as a potential channel to provide this communication. The other fun fact, that encryption policy document was actually 8 years in the draft. It has been discussed in government for 8 years. I actually think that public consultation was great because it provoked controversy, because you know what was being discussed behind closed doors. Industry had been engaged in the document for years and encountered frustration. Now you know publicly what is going on. But this 8 years shows that by the way stuff is happening, you need a permanent voice. So that is part of the idea behind the Internet Freedom Foundation. So again, I want to ask, how many people had heard of IFF before today or before the poster? How many of you had heard of Save the Internet .in? A bit more, right? The idea behind IFF is to have a full-time organization that can channel the voice of users on these issues in India. Be able to build platforms, be able to legally track what's going on, and to put your voice forward without having to depend only on others. For example, I worked in industry previously. I can share that many times in industry, Google, other players often do to try to fight for your rights. My favorite comment is once someone, I think Google or someone was fighting a case and they argued a privacy issue, and the judge said, we're very happy to hear you say that, but why isn't a user group saying that to us? How can you speak on behalf of users? And that's part of the idea here, that we are a group that can speak on behalf of users and be able to do that. How we work, and I'll talk a bit about that. In brief, I will leave it to Paran Kiran. We do law, we do policy, we do tech and tech activism, and more importantly, we also try and raise support for resources. Because in this country, if you're able to mobilize crowd support, there are 2 things. One, simple factual thing, you're not then only restricted by FCRA, the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, which prohibits foreign money from being used for advocacy, which you may notice many countries, many organizations in this country do fantastic policy research. They explicitly say we don't do advocacy. Why? Because they legally barred from doing advocacy. The second important thing is that when people contribute to stuff, policymakers take you seriously. Because when you go into a room with an MP or even with a bureaucrat, the bureaucrat has been appointed by the UPSC, in turn body deposed to Parliament at some point of his life. That MP has been elected by at least 10 lakh people. He's gone through that process, he has gone through that process, they have accountability on it. They respect when people try and represent the majority of people's viewpoints. That's one more reason why we try to be a crowd-supported organization. But we do law and policy, we do technology and engagement and activism. And there are many things we want to do for this year, but I want to take this pause for a moment. I know Apar and Kiran have also talked about this a bit. Do you want to tell a bit about our priorities this year? What we're trying to do? The high level stuff?
So from the technology side, one of the things that we're concerned about is internet censorship. If you go to a website and it's blocked, on what basis is it blocked? Now, as it turns out, the law is a little complicated about this. It's a little ambiguous about how this works. A website can be blocked because DOT decided it's supposed to be blocked. And when DOT issues an order to an ISP saying block it, it's under the license terms of an ISP. These orders are secret. So there is nowhere to go get an authoritative list of websites that have been blocked in India. The other way something to get blocked is by court order. Like whenever there is a movie release, movie producer goes to court and says block all torrent websites because we think our movie will be pirated. It's a fairly abused process, but it's public because it's a court order. You can see what is the list of websites that has been authorized to be blocked. But often what you also find is a website that has no reason to be blocked is still blocked. And this comes out with ISP incompetence. That an ISP does not know how to block properly, so they block an IP address instead of a URL, which means that every other website on the same IP address is also blocked. And it's fairly common. When you're doing shared hosting, you have thousands of websites on a single IP address. So what's happening there is that you blocked an IP because you had to block something that the government decided wanted to be blocked. A whole bunch of other websites got blocked. If it is not a big website like the Google or an Amazon or whatever, the average user is not going to notice that it went away. So some user is going to notice that it went away, but it may turn out that if it's your website that accidentally got blocked like this, you will not be using that particular ISP on which it is blocked, so you don't even know that your own website is being blocked. Because it's working on your ISP but not working on your neighbor's ISP. So this kind of thing happens a lot in India. And even the government does not know what's going on, because there is no single authoritative source of information on what is being blocked in this country. And why it is being blocked? Because if an ISP is blocking something without authorization, then that's an illegal block. So one of the things that we want to solve for is, can we build a technical solution that identifies when a website is being blocked and identifies the reason why it's being blocked. Is this an accidental block? Is it a government order? Is it being blocked across ISPs, or is it only one particular ISP that's blocking it? In this case, what do you do to resolve this problem? Why is this being blocked? If it's an ISP doing it without authorization, then go file a complaint against them and say, stop this block. So one of our projects is that a framework to help identify censorship when it's happening. The other one is, you want to go to shutdowns?
Yeah, thinking about shutdowns, I can jump in on that further.
Yeah. So the other project that we're working on is on internet shutdowns. So as you know, that the law is being abused across India to shut down the internet for all kinds of random reasons, including the fact that the government is conducting an exam and they decided that somebody will cheat, so they shut off the internet in the entire state.
I'm going to just give one statistic to share. India is tied for the most number of shutdowns in the world according to several studies. The other country is Iraq, which means that, by the way, in terms of major democracies in the world, Iraq is a democracy now, but at least they say established democracies in the world, India is number one.
It excludes non-ISIS areas.
with that framing.
Yeah. I think so India is number 3 in the world right now. Do you remember what's number 2?
Sorry?
What's the second place?
Second place.
Sudan is Syria, 4th place is Saudi Arabia, and 3rd place is India. So that's how much censorship we have in this country right now. We're between two Middle Eastern countries in terms of the level of censorship they impose on their own population. In terms of shutting down the internet because the government decided that for some reason it was not nice to have internet access for some period of time. Now this is something that has to stop, and this is not a technology problem, so this is not my particular domain of expertise. It's between Raman and Apar, who come in with a better legal background to understand what this problem is, why is it happening, and what do you do about it.
And so, one thing was that the thing of shutdowns, you see, by the way, that there's an international growing norm against it. So, for example, my full-time job at Access, we run the Keep It On campaign and network, which has been engaging on this with the UN and elsewhere. So, fun fact, the UN Human Rights Council has actually already issued binding standards, which have been, the General Assembly has also voted on. India was part of that vote, which has said that blocking the entire internet in order to address, even for example, a public order issue is disproportionate and goes against existing human rights standards. Because human rights standards aren't vague, by the way. There's the International Covenant on Political Rights, the ICCPR. As you know, India is a signatory to, and Indian judges have directly applied in court cases. Now, you have great now international norms building, but you have every day police officers and others in this country blocking the internet completely. Not just police officers, the DMs, including people who are not empowered even by the most liberal interpretation of our law to do so, but they're doing it because, well, no one challenged them yet. With that, apart, do you want to talk about challenging?
What?
Do you want to talk about DMs, social media censorship and shutdowns?
Yeah, so just to go back to the internet shutdowns campaign also, we hope to start that out just to flag off certain logistics. If you do want to volunteer, please get in touch with us. We are open to throwing open our work Slack to people who are interested in engaging, working on the issue, and we have a flat system in how we work. We engage with you directly. I'll be chatting with you directly. Raman will be chatting with you directly, and we hope that there's a sense of community which comes through working on this issue. In terms of timelines, we hope to launch it around March 3 or March 13. It may come with the AIB video again, so yeah, it may blow up. I know it's a peg, but you need a peg to join people. And from what we've seen recently, and of course, if we have friends abroad, Daily Show seems to be the daily respite in a lot of countries as well, right? We are passing through some very troubling times, and what gives hopes to lawyers, and what's been a sign of hope has been the stay order which has been obtained against the immigration order issued by Donald Trump's administration. And what has been
the state declared it?
Yeah, so but how did that come about? It was on the basis of an organization which has existed for a long period of time, advocacy networks which were supported by lawyers, and lawyers themselves having that sense of community and engaging on the issue. They actually parked themselves on airports, they offered their services for free, and I think that's possible, and it does give value to all of us. Now, we are facing our own unique challenges in India, and why we have come here also is to talk to all of you and to request you is that go into private practice, make your money, but if you do feel that little sense of discontent, do volunteer your time or give us back some of your money. We will give it to you. Let me be straight with you. Okay?
So, IFF is completely crowdfunded, including personal donation. So we work and we pay in order to work. So
yeah, we are hoping to be like the Aam Aadmi Party. I don't know, I'm making a lot of
I see the investigation
I
happening.
don't know, depending on your political views. Totally. So, just in terms of also how we are working much more seriously, why I think lawyers now need to open up and engage on these issues is that the internet has been recognized as a great leveler in terms of increasing not only access diversity but enabling freedom of speech for a lot of people. So what you notice is that internet is being used even by marginal communities, people who have been historically discriminated, giving them finally a medium to go out and to air out their grievances. And we notice that social media is being used for very good uses. It's being used, for instance, to highlight caste atrocities, and which is traditionally being ignored by the mainstream media. And I think that is why a deepening engagement with the internet is inherent to advancing any kind of civil rights agenda in this country. Now, we are working broadly on 3 issues, and you can view it in terms of our charter values. The first is with respect to web censorship and openness. Our internet shutdowns campaign is going to be a core part of that. The second is on user privacy and using the internet much more securely, which also has components of encryption. The third is furthering innovation as well as network neutrality, maintaining the openness of the internet. We think these 3 are very solid values to put our work behind and hopefully build an institution with people who are younger, understand the internet much better, and have actually been born with the internet. Even though we are relatively younger, it's a range here. So, yeah, but still, you know, the thing is, we still access the internet when we were in our early teens. People who grew up with the internet grew up with a completely different experience. They're able to shape their personalities, their values according to the content they discover online. And I think it gives them the full promise of what they can become.
So
Psychopaths.
I'm going to be a scaremonger here and say, one thing to remember is the internet you grew up with, there's no guarantee you'll be the internet in the future. It is a thing you forget, right? So, just buy another, broadcast, right? So I'm the first few people, we grew up with cable and satellite broadcast in this country, and satellite dish was installed. It was a source of excitement. I used to love watching basically anime, cartoons, that sort of stuff. By the way, Animax is not available in this country anymore. You know why? Because the broadcasting regulations were changed to make it much easier for the people in the middle, MSOs, the broadcast distributors, and they jacked up prices so much that essentially in India you have to pay for creating content, shooting stuff, buying licenses, then you have to pay someone to transmit for you across it, and then pay other people in between to distribute it. Smaller players said we can't afford this, and they pulled it. So Animax is not available in this country, for example. We mention this in net neutrality because this is a reality. What you see today, and many people say, oh, the internet is fantastic, it's neutral. Some people debate that it is, but they say, oh, it will remain forever. It won't. It can be erased. See, for example, how people in several places are sometimes afraid about posting stuff on Facebook or WhatsApp because they're being monitored because they're worried about that. So that is one reason why we're here. We're here to represent a voice of continuous change, not just for the status quo to make it better. We're here to put people on notice. So if law enforcement misuses their powers, we will put them on notice. For example, others have helped send notices to district magistrates who issued 144 orders, which are defined under the CRPC, right? And they've said, under 144 of the CRPC, we say you cannot discuss demonetization on social media. Interesting. That's not legal and you're getting a notice. Why? Because until you send something, outrage is not enough. Outrage must be channeled into the mainstream press, to policymakers and in legal process. Lawyers know this. You must put it there in documentation, even if it has no immediate impact. It's the first warning, right? Don't do this. Then you take them to court. Then you fight it out, and then as the ACLU says, then you win. But you try and keep doing that. I bring up a couple of things just to re-emphasize what Kiran and Par said. We are going to focus on free expression, particularly around internet shutdowns, and make sure the Shreya Singhal ruling, which is a good basic standard. We could say it should be better, but it's at least an opening standard that should not be undermined. And that's not guaranteed by the way. Even today, the Supreme Court, even this week, the Supreme Court has heard cases where they're saying there should be proactive censorship or monitoring. And we can debate some of these issues here. We'd love to take questions on that. Privacy is like the lightning rod in India right now at the moment. The Aadhaar project is one big part of it, of course, but it's not just that. The financial sector, especially post-demonetization, the debate has shown how privacy regulation is core to many things there. And many of you also, I'm sure, track things ranging from sexuality rights to everything is all linked to privacy, and this is a situation where the Indian Attorney General has said there is no right to privacy, or its contours are unclear. There are different things said by different people, depending on where you catch them, in court, in parliament, before cameras. We are saying there is a right to privacy. We run that campaign as well. It's a small one, very specialized one, but we will be bringing it back. It's called Privacy is a Right. The idea to remind people that privacy is a fundamental right in this country, especially in the digital age, and that it should be advanced. As we mentioned, net neutrality, we're not letting go, because net neutrality there's much more left to be done. And when you leave it also only just to the lobbyists, well, capture happens. So we're worried about that. As Kiran Kapar also just briefly mentioned, we have different ways of working. Firstly, your interest, ask us questions, make suggestions. We try and respond in person on Twitter. Many of the ideas and tactics by the have come out of people suggesting, why don't you try this? People calling up, I know someone here right now, they're very interested in this camp. Or a journalist saying, I'm really interested in this, what do you think? And then they talk and they say later, oh, please join this panel discussion, or actually, by the way, there's this public meeting happening, do you guys know about it? So these are different things that are there. We broadly want to ensure, by the way, that law and policy and digital stuff in this country is not determined in purely Delhi rooms or in like Bombay boardrooms in the RBI or elsewhere. You have a right to be able to engage in that, whether you're in Hyderabad, Bangalore, Coimbatore, Ranchi, wherever you are. That only happens if you ask for it. Otherwise, it is only the powerful who influence things. The powerful may come to right decisions, but not always the same. As Apar mentioned, support us. We all individually contribute ourselves. We donated to IFF so that this can be a user and crowd-driven organization that is free to say what it has to say without depending on only large donors or foreign funding, which impedes what you can do. There's space for that research, but you need an advocacy voice as well. And give your time. As Apar said, work for others, donate time to us. Work in your practice and come and donate time. Apar runs his practice. I technically donate my time because I work full time for another organization as well. But also come work with us. We have interns who have come, we have associates, we have an internship program that we're scaling out where people can come and work, whether you're interested in law, whether you're interested in policy, or whether, surprise, interested in boring management and operations. If you want to help build something, this is the moment here that it is there. Apart mentioned the ACLU, there's the Electronic Frontier Foundation, there's many other organizations. They all came about because people gave time and they gave effort. In fact, our entire idea is to not be the ones doing this. We want to kickstart this, and we came to NANSA because we want the next generation of lawyers to come in and do this, whether it's on law, whether it's on activism, whether it's on management. And more importantly, we wanted to shape what the priorities are. So if you care about privacy, if you care about free expression, if you care about other issues as well, you tell us what we can do, and we are here to channel that voice, or in fact give you space to be able to articulate this, whether in Delhi, whether in Bangalore, elsewhere. Right now, we're mostly concentrated in these two cities, which tend to be hubs, but there's scope for much more. And with that, I think we should, just open up for questions, because we love your suggestions and ideas, and don't hold back in asking us questions.
So my question is about how you balance the need for transparency and accountability with the need and openness with the need for privacy. And the context for this question comes from the Whois database that ICANN has, where the need for information about everybody who owns a website is something that they're debating on right now, and I'm just wondering how you balance those two questions.
I can take a shot at that, and I'll try and connect the two together as well. So while IFM has not said much about Whois and other stuff, we have articulated views on privacy and transparency. At Access, I know, and we have at the organization filed on the Whois discussion. So for those of you who don't know, Whois is the tool that allows you to see who has registered a website, what you can do there. The interesting thing, of course, is that technically there's already some scope built in to limit information, because you can choose to contract with the registrar who will basically provide a privacy service. So they will say, we won't say who will own it, another entity will be the one who registers it, and you are contracting with that entity. It's been a subject of debate. ICANN has had consultations on it, and
it's not allowed in India.
It's not allowed in Nixie. Yeah, so the Indian registrar doesn't allow it. Other registrars do. Now this is the scope. So different registrars may take different positions. You could argue there should be space for it, and the challenge is that you could say in particular there's transparency requirements from government, especially, and like government like websites and other things like that. Government may choose to interpret their own regulations on where they give their domains. By the way, India is an exception. In a sense, many other countries, the national like .in or the country level domain is not necessarily run by the government itself. It's subcontracted further. Here it's still more tightly controlled by our government. What you do want to ensure is that when people do make a request for that information, if that information is subject to restrictions, rather it's put under a privacy shield in a sense, that there should be some process to it, so not that everyone can just pierce it. Because to answer today, there are lots of people who use privacy shield programs really well to say that, okay, I do want to secure information who owns this website, and that's my private right to do so, you figure it out. And at IFF, the one thing we have articulated is on transparency versus privacy in the context of the right to be forgotten. So what we have done, for example, is there is a judgment, not a judgment, sorry, there's a case going on in the Delhi High Court where someone has asked the Delhi High Court to intervene on this, and I let a power drop to our position there a bit.
But before going to even evaluating a position, this is how us as an organization would discuss this issue. Okay, and this is just going back to boring process, because process is what builds really big companies like probably Infosys, right? That's why we have these people on these flights with these long Excel sheets, because they do have some value. Okay, so in terms of a process, how would we talk about this issue is that we would first take it to a technologist. We would first take it to a person who actually does understand what is the underlying need for the disclosure, what is the underlying need for the value of information itself, which is present in the Whois database. And we would firstly try to draw out a debate in terms of what is the technology demanding and why is it requiring it in terms of the code itself. Then we come to the policy, then we come to the legal proposal. And that's how, in terms of a process, we would evaluate it. And I know it sounds bureaucratic, but that's just the way we think things should go about right now. Even as lawyers, when we deal with clients, we would first like to understand the commercials of the transaction, what are the unique details about it. I know lawyers who work on arbitration cases with respect to power plants who understand the functioning of a power plant before coming out of the case itself. Okay? The second thing is, picking up from what Raman just mentioned with respect to the right to be forgotten case,
there is a gentleman who's approached the Honorable High Court of Delhi asking for a search result to be removed which indexes a case law which mentions his name, and the case law relates to a personal dispute between his mother-in-law and his wife, which has now been settled. So somewhat embarrassing, showing up as the first result when his name is typed down in the internet, in the Google search engine, and the case itself has been pulled from the court database by Indian Qanun and then subsequently indexed on Google, right? He's not only asking for delisting from Google, he's asking for deletion from Indian Qanun as well. Okay, so we are essentially concerned that such a judicial ruling, in the absence of an underlying data protection law, we don't have a statute, we don't have a privacy law in India, we don't have a data protection directive in India, and the right to be forgotten case as emerged in the European Union was on the basis of a regulation and local legislation. There were certain policy choices which were made. There was an expert body or a referee, as Raman likes to refer to, data protection authority, which was taking certain calls as to what are classes of information which can be protected from disclosure and satisfy certain standards of privacy, and in some where public interest outweighs the privacy interest and disclosure should be made. Now these policy calls have not been made in India. Now what happens when a court enters such a domain, and especially in an adversarial context where there is a petitioner and a respondent? The petitioner being a private party, the respondent being a government, and the other respondents being online intermediaries. Well, you get results such as in the Sabu Matthew George case, which was order uploaded 2 days ago, and you can scroll through it on Bar and Bench, where there are close to 100 keywords which are sought to be proactively censored and scrubbed off by search engines themselves from their search results if they go towards promoting prenatal diagnostic kits which can be sold online. Now this is a call search engines have to make by themselves. They are becoming judicial censors, and our judiciary, without deciding individual instances, is seeking to outsource its entire job to a search engine. It's problematic. But again, the litigant mix in that case also is petitioner, government, private companies. So where is the user interest? Ultimately, who gets impacted? All of us. And that is why organizations like IFF are important to implead in these cases. When I graduated from law school, one thing I understood very well: I will never be a litigant in an Indian court. And I've broken that vow through this organization by pleading in this case. So there must be good reasons for that.
And just end with one last thing, which was the reason in the right to be forgotten case when we also intervened, is we said people have a right to privacy. Other parties should not be able to go directly between private parties themselves. So one private party going to another private party saying, I have an automatic right to tell you what to take down, when it pertains to public sector information. So to go to your transparency point, ultimately Article 19(1)(a) has been printed by our courts has said you have a right to access information. And when it's public sector information and people are asking for that to be scrubbed, we're very concerned. But we are arguably less people interested in tech than more traditional RTI loving people, because we were affected by that. We'd say only go to that if Parliament or others have had a discussion. And going back to your original question, in who is ICANN started that process. They had a policy development plan process, PDP, they've had different discussions around it. So at least they've had that going there. So we would say only do this subject to open debate, whether in Parliament or whether before the technical body concerned.
But in terms of immediate remedy in the right to forgotten case, seeking redaction be a better... Exactly,
and that's what other courts are considering. And there is a Karnataka ruling, there is a Gujarat ruling as well.
I mean, you have a public interest
under the inherent rules of the court. But the first prayer is recognize and declare that a right to be forgotten exists under Articles 14, 19 and 21 of the Constitution of India. Hence the doctrinal basis itself will be laid down by court. And you know how the doctrinal basis will be utilized, right? By not by people who are...
You will have a fair set of supervision software.
or whoever just wants certain information to be scrubbed off the internet, right?
I'd just like to add in terms of who is right, it's not the issue specific to India. So it has been actively discussed at ICANN, and if you are here for the ICANN meeting in November,
Just use the mic for recording.
so the ICANN meeting is done in November in Hyderabad.
It's not on.
Also introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Srinivas Kodali. I'm a volunteer with a lot of internet organizations and movements in India. I'm based in Hyderabad. So regarding the WHOIS issue, it's an international issue and it's not specific to India. It has been actively discussed at ICANN. And if you're looking to engage on that particular issue, ICANN is probably the best place you need to engage.
Happy to help them.
Yeah. And the best part is ICANN also provides you scholarships to travel to their public meetings in any of their countries to actually talk about these issues. You can set up a local chapter here through one of its internet organizations, Internet Society. Hyderabad has no chapter on it. Get 25 people in this room, we can set it up next month. And you'll get resources, you can actually advocate about it, you can start discussing things. I believe they're going to help you with it, but you will also get other resources from other international institutions as well.
But if you have a view, you need to be in the room.
There were several hands up.
Yeah. So my question is with regards to Sahil Matthew George was the Union of India. So you talked about how it's an overreach of the Supreme Court in case of it contradicting Shreya Singh Union of India and the information technology guidelines. So sir, we've always seen these third-party platforms like Google using selectively the definition of passive conduits or the definition of content providers in order to, number one, escape liability, or in cases to get First Amendment rights. So with that in context, we've also seen third-party platforms like OLX post heinous advertisements like selling of koala bears online, which is in itself a huge violation of the law. So would you still say it's like an overreach of the Supreme Court, and if that is the case, where in the very region of internet law, where should the line be drawn? In case of them using this very characterization selectively of a passive conduit and of a content provider.
I think the call has been taken very clearly by Justice Nariman in his opinion in Shreya Singhal, where he indicates that a specific legal determination with respect to a koala bear needs to be made by a court or a executive body. You know, there's such a wonderful thing which happened in China was that to circumvent censorship, the famous Chinese artist Ai Weiwei, he just posted the picture of a chair and everyone started posting the picture of chairs. And what happened now, when you put chair in a search engine in China, you can't see it. So these are the consequences which will flow through these actions. We're already standing up for the national anthem before these are happening. Okay, so let us not mistake what vote we are walking towards if we are endorsing such kind of excesses just because it goes towards satisfying our some kind of overarching concern. Why? Let me just add. How many prosecutions have been there under the PNDT Act? How many complaints has the petitioner sent for actual sale and purchase of kits? How many specific complaints of websites selling these kits have been made? Do these kits actually work? Because I've checked up the scientific literature and they don't. So these claims need to be examined by the court before even engaging in this roving inquiry. What is the penultimate paragraph of the order written by the same judge who's written the national anthem order? Respondents number 3 to 5 need to start. This order is being written with the objective of respondent number 3 to 5 finally complying and respecting with Indian law. So it is again born out of a sense of nationalism where a foreign platform by itself is seen to be engaging in activities to further speech values but conflicts with what are specific Indian what are the specific Indian demands with respect to this platform. So I would just say please be wary.
So I just had a 60-second intervention, and of course I get the disclosure, I worked for Google. I didn't work on that case, I didn't even track it, it was very closely. And venture, do platforms misuse exemption from liability? In many places, absolutely. In India, actually less so. More in the US, where Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act gives a very wide cover. And for those interested, I'm happy to talk about 230 offline because it's a very long discussion. But short answer on this one, they actually want to go to the point and forget the kids. They don't want you to access the literature on the subject. So to give you an equivalent example, it is saying that, okay, there are certain things that this warehouse is selling that's problematic, let's seize or block that. Here is, by the way, a database of where the warehouses are, we will block access to that as well. Because what they're saying is when certain keywords pop up, we will not let you access those sites or those results should be blocked. Now that's deeply problematic because, by the way, I have friends and family who are doctors and others who would say, yeah, we want to be able to access information about PNED debates or even literature, sometimes to disprove it or even sometimes to say, by the way, this is what someone is trying to use. That's the concern here. The court has essentially bypassed the share single standard and what should be an executive function, where the executive functions under law, a flawed law by the way, that I greatly believe is still not transparent or accountable, but a law that is there, that allows you to block certain websites or block other content, issue orders, no. Advertisements, which are a commercial proactive step, are already blocked. And fun fact, again, they have been blocked for over 7 years before Sabu Matthew. All companies have that practice, whether it's Google, Yahoo, Bing. By the way, no, Indian companies are not in the case. So this is an interesting example of politics versus like law, right? In terms of how Sabu's acted. But other companies are not there, the OLX and others that you mentioned. All of them are practicing, if you provide access to PNED, we will block that. They block gambling ads in India. They block even games of chance. There are people who have fantasy sports things. And they've argued vociferously that Indian law now allows it, by the way. But they're blocked. So that is there. So proactive commercial steps, companies will always do more. Because when you're making money, you know you're going to be targeted. I'd be really worried here that essentially this is the equivalent of you saying that this library index card must be burnt or blocked. And that's very troubling. And I would say, okay, even if you're going to burn and block it, did it come under executive action under law? No. Here, we will create a doctrine of preemptive block? What's it? Auto block.
Doctrine of auto block.
Auto block is a very, very, very scary term when it comes to Article 19(1)(a). I do not think it should be there. It's again subject to the court and final outcome here. I would prejudge that. Let that be there, but let that be a better outcome than the doctrine of auto block. That should not be a doctrine. We have strong views on that.
Hi, my name is Yuvraj. So the law is complex, right? Tech is complex. The interface is super complex. So my question is, how do you make the law and technology more accessible to the common person?
I think one of the first problems with that is that the two domains don't even talk to each other that much. That's the first problem to fix. And you can see that happening right now with something like Aadhaar, where it is a group of techies operating outside of the law and essentially trying to say, let's just make the law suit what we want as a technology project, rather than saying, let's work under the existing framework of law. So if you don't fix that first conversation, there's no point trying to go to the public and get the larger debate going, because at that point you're not talking to you're not talking to the people where the decision is being made. And honestly, it's not an easy problem. One of the things that we're doing as IFF, as being a one-half tech group and one-half legal group, is at least between ourselves, let's start having these conversations. Let's make sure that the volunteers who come on board help also understand the nuances of each of these domains and why there are complexities in these operations. Hopefully that goes forward in the campaigns that we put out as well, and in the materials that we put out. Network neutrality in particular is super complex, because network neutrality is not a technology thing, it is a legal thing. But it's a legal thing using technical jargon, which makes it extremely confusing to both sides. Because the network engineer will tell you that network neutrality is bullshit. It is not possible to have neutrality because a network cannot work if it does not discriminate. But then you point out that this is not network technical discrimination, this is legal discrimination, this is commercial discrimination. Where ISP says, for commercial reasons, I will behave in a certain manner with a particular party. It has nothing to do with underlying technology. So one of the problems, and network neutrality is a very good example of how understanding these nuances is important, because otherwise you keep arguing that everybody else is an idiot, you don't seem to understand how this works. And one of the things that we had to do to even push the net neutrality campaign in the tech community is repeatedly point out that this is not a technical issue at all. It is entirely a legal issue, and it's both people understand that this is not what you think is happening, it's what's happening a layer above. Okay? So with net neutrality, we've had some level of success in providing material to each of these communities, explaining how it matters to them and what part of their own systems don't actually apply in this case. But there's something that we'll have to constantly do with every new campaign. You might say that anytime we come up with a campaign that involves something that's a cross-domain of two different things, especially when we're talking about privacy and identity, it's once again going to be this extremely complex cross-domain issue that you need to break down very carefully and point out that what you think is the problem is not really the problem.
So we, as you know, we also talk to stand-up comics. We reach beyond technologists and lawyers. We seek to build a community support, a popular voice. One instance is also the speech bill campaign to reform India's defamation laws. It advocates for the repeal of section 499 of the Indian Penal Code, which contains the criminal remedy of defamation, and in its place brings a modern civil remedy which has a capped damage, okay, and has certain processes to expedite a civil suit for defamation. So, technical jargon, right? Nobody cares about this. How do we make people care about it? This time we don't get a video. We actually first put out explainer drafts, reach out to a lot of people, ask them for support who are actually affected by it. They're supporting organizations on speechbill.in, which include all the leading publishers in India. They're individuals who include senior advocates of high courts. And we have asked people on Twitter to share their experiences. Lyricists like Varun Grover, stand-up comics like Aditi Mittal Biswa, Maheshwar Perry, who fought the IIPM litigations which were filed against them in different courts all over the country. We talk about the issue itself. When the speech bill itself was listed for introduction and unfortunately Parliament did get disrupted, we again made a 2-page note explaining the process, and it is actually called a 2-page note. It's titled in big text for the
2-page. It's a hard book. You will not go beyond 2 pages.
Yeah, that's it. And it's bulleted. So we try to make the issue simple, relevant. At the same time, we don't dumb it down. We also make the injury much more visible. What's the actual underlying issue which is at stake, much more visible to people.
And just add this thing, this is my pet thing. As a policy lawyer, is actually an obligation upon lawyers to help make things simple and explain it to people. Because we have an obligation to make sure our technical functioning, just like a tech product manager can simplify the complex functioning of a WhatsApp or whatever else into a basic, this is a messaging service, this is how you do it. So this is the function we provide societies. If we don't do that, we're failing in our function. Because we need to facilitate this discussion. Even when it happens in courts and others, it must be triggered by what's happening publicly. And when we fail to provide that interface, we result in doctrines of autoblog and other things. But like that is the role like we function there.
Reputation is a fundamental.
But not to this.
So the first is regarding the law aspect, and this is specifically to the other. Now, as far as I understood it, the other is held not to be mandatory by courts, but it's been increasingly becoming mandatory. The government has been making it mandatory in essentially everything. And my question is, how can they do that when it's been ordered not to? And the second is a technological question with regards to the incompetency of the government. So if you look at the sites that are blocked, these are the HTTP of these are blocked. But if you go to the HTTPS, it's suddenly unblocked. Now, when you have a government this incompetent, like very basic things, what is really the purpose of making these regulations?
Okay, so just to answer on the HTTP thing, that's not the government being incompetent, that's ISP. And ISP incompetence is all over the place.
It's government mandated.
It's government mandated, but not government monitored, which is where the problem is. So the government doesn't know that whether the rule is being applied or not.
And I would say that if we are relying on the incompetence of the government to allow us access to internet services, we may be disappointed one day.
And it's not a joke in the region like Thailand and others are very, very competent governments when they come to this.
Actually,
they deploy it.
So government knows about VPN.
Look at Russia as well. Again,
it knows about all these things. If you listen to what government guys are saying, they will develop these competences. And anyways, modern models of engagement are not for the government to execute these projects in-house, but to look at external private sector contractors, which may then bring in to fruition what is the government intent. Going to the first question itself, this is a non-IFF comment because IFF is yet to take a position on the larger Aadhaar project, even though it has signaled concern with respect to privacy violations, which I enabled through it in our DRI files. Now, I've written an op-ed with another lawyer who's leading a group of lawyers, the junior lawyers on these cases. There are close to about 30 to 40 odd lawyers working here. I'm not the only one, I'm a very junior one in the chain. And so the op-ed is called Project of Defiance. It explains the legal position. But the answer is not legal while the government is pushing ahead. And so the answers also with respect to enforcement of Supreme Court orders rely on a huge amount of complexity. The court does not have the answer is complex actually. The court doesn't have the power of the purse or the sword, which means it has limited power and hopes that its orders are carried through by the political executive, which are not done quite often. In fact, the orders in, and this is an instance I'm quite fond of citing, in I think in Prakash Singh's case, to set up police accountability committees have never been implemented, even though repeated contempt notices have been given to chief secretaries of state governments to set that up. These are orders which were passed. Contempt applications were filed, contempt notices were issued, chief secretaries appeared before the Supreme Court, apologized, gave undertakings, not done, again contempt notices issued. Because at the end of the day, will the court jail the political executive? It's somewhat of a game of brinkmanship. Also, Aadhaar is much more complex. It has massive public sector buy-in. A lot of people actually think it will benefit and it may result in certain benefits. There is government buy-in for a large amount of time. It has ridden on uncritical media portrayals as all harms have been sought to be intangible, distant, remote in the future, not evidenced. Also, people have got a sense of identity by holding an Aadhaar card because they've been denied their basic human rights entitlements, and they have been finally given this card, the shiny new card. So for them, it's a creation of identity and recognition by the state. Wow, you finally think I exist, right? It's like somebody who's been ignoring you for a long time, right? And says that, hi, adds you on Facebook. You say, yeah, I'll accept this. No, it's like that, seriously. So Aadhaar is a much more complex thing. It does ride on a lot of support. And that's why the court orders are very difficult to implement.
And one thing, other thing with Aadhaar, remember, is that, when you're just speaking personally, is that its implementation seems that it's also being done by state governments, although there's coordination happening, it's been happening in the beginning of the project. And I'm happy to state that, including to any member of the Aadhaar community. The reality is the opposition has not always been coordinated in that fashion, because they're different people, right? The individual people affected by it now, some amount of coordination. If you're interested in regular stuff, visit the Rethink Aadhaar Twitter handle, which tries to coordinate and provide information there on some of this stuff. But the challenges are separate. For example, surprise, surprise, people don't know this, many state governments are not fans of Aadhaar. The West Bengal Assembly passed a resolution stating they oppose the mandatory nature of Aadhaar. That is not communicated in Delhi for many, many reasons. But its challenge will occur. But to a simple thing, until you challenge, until you file something, until you coordinate, people win and give you an equivalent. I'm showing this to a power on the flight. And the current challenge to the Muslim ban in the US, right? And it is a Muslim ban. If you listen to Trump, it is a Muslim ban. The current challenge to the Muslim ban seems like lots of different groups doing it. They all planned. The ACLU and others talked to other groups well in advance, including the Arab American Initiative, many other groups. The state attorney generals in the US, the Democratic attorney generals, talked to each other. It's a great story where A.G. Schneiderman of New York was speaking to his counterparts in Washington State and others. They planned in the first few days of the Trump administration, we will have to coordinate and do our strategy and do that there. So what I'm trying to say is it requires people to fight back, understand what's going on, talk to technologists. A lot of technologists have deep concern on Aadhaar data and what's there. We have to talk about stories about what is being leaked from Aadhaar if you're interested after this. But you also need to coordinate strategy. It's communication, strategy and planning. Because the thing about all litigation thing is, litigation is not individual, it's actually strategic litigation, which means you need to plan for years and figure out what to do. Also because the courts are overburdened, and as Apar mentioned, the courts are actually the weakest branch of government. We romanticize them, but they are the weakest branch of government. work with others as well. Because for example, here, actually there was cross-party consensus against many parts of Aadhaar Act, and Aadhaar Bill was actually amended significantly by the Rajya Sabha. The government immediately went and tried to overturn the money bill challenge, which is now subject to a Supreme Court hearing. But parliamentarians engaged, so you need all branches of government to weigh into the conversation. So don't invest in money.
So just trying to the technical thing about blocking. One of the ways to understand again from a technology perspective, why is say HTTP block but not HTTPS? It's not like you can't block it on HTTPS. It's more like if you understand the execution mechanics of how an ISP works, it becomes a little more obvious. For instance, most ISPs, their day-to-day challenge is keeping the network alive and acquiring customers. Okay? It is not technology innovation. So most of the technology that an ISP uses is just something they bought off the shelf. They bought it from somewhere. So when you go buy a fancy router from somewhere that has, say, a blocking capability, now it assumes something about the content of what's flowing through your network. Because if you do IP level blocking, any router can do that. If you want to do, on the other hand, very specific blocking like block a specific URL, block a specific domain, and so forth, you need an app level capability, which is deep packet inspection. That you want deep packet inspection abilities to say examine a packet and decide if this packet matches your pattern and therefore everything else has to be blocked. Now the first level that you would do when you're doing HTTP blocking is lift the host header. You can look at the host header that goes in the first packet of a HTTP, right? And fortunately, it almost always happens in the first TCP packet. The TCP packet is typically 1500 bytes, but sometimes it is 1492 bytes. Unless you're asking for a very long URL, your host header is going to be in the very first packet. If it's a very long URL that exceeds like 1000 plus characters, then the host header will be in the second packet. So now, a router's ability to watch for the second packet in a transmission and check if that plus the first packet constitutes a violation, then cut off the connection. Now that's a slightly more advanced ability than saying sniff the first packet. So that basically says that your ISP's technology purchase has to be one step higher, and they must have done it at some point because these are investments that you keep for a decade at least. So you can't replace them just because the government's changing their rules or just because technology is modern. Now you do HTTPS. But if you want to do blocking at HTTPS, you're sniffing the SSL certificate and looking for the domains embedded in the SSL certificate and saying if this particular domain matches, block it. But that was again technology of 5 years ago. What you've got now, thanks to Windows XP going out of common usage, is a new way to do certificates called server name indication, which means the technology has changed once again. Windows XP was a roadblock, Windows XP is dead, everybody is moved on. And now you have SNI being popularly used. If you look at Let's Encrypt, it's an entirely SNI based approach to doing certificates. Once again, technology purchased 5 years ago for blocking is not going to work with SNI. So now it's a replacement again. And these are not software upgrades most of the time because there's something that you buy in the hardware. So what you get in an ISP is a new ISP, like say Reliance, is obviously going to buy the latest hardware and the latest technology. Someone who's been in operations for a while is just going to hope that the government does not harass them for this. Because who wants to make investments just because the government keeps changing their mind about what kind of censorship they want? So breaking it down into how a company actually operates and what their level of interest in it. Obviously they don't like blocking because customers harass them for it all the time. So you're just going to hope that you pass some minimum criteria to say, look, I did my due job because my license requires me to block, I did it. User found a workaround, I don't care.
But the government can monitor.
No. How do they know? They need to be on the network.
It could. And what you could also say is, do you want them to, like, for example, do you want them to block entire domains or do deep packet inspection? Which is the other fact. For example, the other thing behind the reality is, they don't want to block off entire domains because that triggered massive outrage in the country. And warnings from like members of parliament, ministers and others saying don't go to that level yet. Don't let that happen in that fashion. So in fact, it's more troubling because while that outrage doesn't happen incrementally, the blocklist in India has many, many thousands of websites now. No one knows it. I can share that I know one major telecom company which now owns a former public sector entity. I'm giving you lots of hints about who this is. They have said they in fact find it difficult to run their network because there are so many different block lists from before that they just want it cleaner. Now, for example, this is technical stuff. You might argue as lawyers and as citizens, is this okay and comfortable? Which is another discussion. but like this is all happening.
Some of the block lists have about 500 to 600 domains without specific findings of illegality, even on the contents of the domain, leave aside the specific web page which is being blocked. Each block order is titled top secret. Yeah. Yeah. So Pinterest will not go away.
Pinterest was blocked in many telecom networks in this country for no clear reason.
Hi. So I'm Deep. I'm a second year student here. So I have two questions actually. So you spoke of this recent efforts you've been making when these violations happen. You're putting them on notice. You're sending out these legal issues. What when there's no explicit censorship as such, but the censorship is coming from within? Let me give you an example. For example,
we can't see where you are.
I'm right.
Where is it?
Yeah. So, for example, content on say Netflix isn't censored, but Amazon Prime Video, when it's come out, it's censored its own content for fear of what may happen in the future, the policy changes. So here there's nothing you can actively do to put someone on notice per se, because nothing has happened yet, but at the same time it's largely contingent on, let's say, the government of the day. So could there be some objective guidelines set out or something that gives the industry a sense of what they can expect, first of all? My second question is with respect to, you spoke of how the internet gives, say, marginalized communities a chance to speak out. Now the issue here is on certain social media or like other platforms on the internet, there's often counter to that speech which could amount to hate speech or something that further subverts the marginal community. Now, say Facebook, for example, if you report this, it doesn't fall under their criteria of hate speech and hence no action will be taken. So the question first, do you think there should be a regulator from the government that should intervene in any case on the internet? Second of all, if that does happen, like how do you assert its independence from the government of the day, something that would act against such form of speech irrespective of the political standing?
So, try that. The first one, by the way, great question. Why I jumped on this is exactly what our first intern at IFF and our associate talked about, which is about streaming sites. And the reality is this, right? This is not corporate practice. It's in fact not. It's not censored as per the Cinematograph Act. It is an act of self-censorship they have already taken. Why have they done that in Amazon Video's case? Because they're worried about being targeted. Just like how today you can't see two people of the same gender kiss on most mainstream broadcast TV. You can't hear the word cow. Or you can hear the word cow, but the subtitle says something else, and many other things. Why? Because broadcast networks are really afraid that they're going to be targeted, sometimes by non-state actors, but they worry that state actors will either target them, or even worse, if someone targets them, state actors won't defend them. And that is troubling, right? That is what we need to prevent when it comes to the internet. And that's what we're trying to ensure, that A, when you try to apply standards on contact or content on the web, what do you apply? For example, Netflix is right now not Government Cinematograph Act. There was a proposal even a couple of, like, I think 4 years ago, which said covers Cinematograph Act to apply to streaming services or online video services. That was not brought into Parliament, it's not passed. Someone has taken players to court. There is a challenge in the Delhi High Court where Hotstar has been sued, and one of the things that is being argued is this, like, content standards should apply. And the examples of where now some of this stuff has become judicially determined policy may be taken up there. But I would argue, if you're concerned about free speech, A, whenever anyone goes beyond their powers, challenge them, issue them a notice, make sure you have an ecosystem where in fact courts come and say, no, we'll protect you. For example, in a similar situation in the cinema scene, I forget the name, the movie about the dam for Tamil Nadu and Kerala was subject to blocking bans in the state. Now, after censor board review, censorship and a certificate being issued, the state government still blocked it. And then the justification they gave was law and order. And eventually the Supreme Court ordered that, saying, no, once something has been passed, it is our job to ensure that it is shown even if it upsets people. So it goes to the fact that you want to push courts and policymakers to say, no, we stand up for people's rights. That is the intent for which we operate. To try and force people to say, we will stand up for their rights. If you want to ensure, of course, private parties don't do this, some of them may still go ahead. You can put pressure on them as consumers, say, don't do this, we raise a challenge, we're concerned. But the first step to do is make sure the environment is conducive. Because today, if you ask Amazon, they'll say, yeah, but you ask us to take a risk on this and we are not willing to. Netflix says we are not. And in fact, by the way, look at this court case, we'll anyway be subject to some crazy challenge. Who is fighting for us in the courts? And we don't want to be the only ones, we will be there, others should be there. But until you have that challenge, you won't. Like in the US, some of the best things the companies have done is not been due to them fighting in courts. It's because the Electronic Frontier Foundation went, sued the US federal government to challenge them and came out with a ruling. Or came out with a gold standard on that. So that stuff there. I'll let Apar jump in on the second point. The thing I just mentioned is that in this country, the police can send orders and should often, can initiate prosecution, and that's something that should happen. Notice the number of prosecutions that happen for trolling in this country. Not trolling, let's say sexual harassment clearly, alright, very few. Also notice the fact that you have blocking powers under the IT Act. Again, I said powers that I have problems with. How many times has it been used for something like this? Tricky, but there are existing frameworks, so I'll let Apar add to that.
I think your concern is with more in terms of direct threats of violence, rape against women, and also violations of the atrocities against scheduled castes and tribes Act. Okay, as opposed to much more generalized, larger hate speech, which would cause imminent lawlessness of that line. Now the problem in hate speech, if I focus to the second part, is the underlying legal code itself. It's fairly broad, it's vague, and it's been used and abused. It's been used against Wendy Doniger to shut her book down, to launch prosecutions all over. Okay, so the first thing is the substantive basis of the legal code itself is vague. Now, if you're wanting to blame the platform itself for enforcing its terms of service in a manner which it deems suitable by itself, right? You can do that. That's an independent critique. But the state itself has not had any clear definition in India with respect to what constitutes hate speech, spread across various provisions, principally 4 of them under the Indian Penal Code. The second thing is that when you also look at hate speech and how violent threats, etc., are dealt online, I'm going back to my previous answer. Who judges? Why regulator? Why are all these things being mentioned? We have a judicial process which exists out there, right? There is a police department which exists out there. There is an order which can be sent by the court after gauging the specific illegality in the matter, okay? Or after the police, after it registers an FIR. So it's not as if there is a prevention of legal capacity. There's a prevention of substantive basis in law to regulate the internet. It is just that social prejudice which exists are of such a nature that if you go into a police station, and I'm not generalizing, and I love the police like everyone does, okay, but if you go into a police station as a female and you say that I've been threatened with rape, there are high chances the police inspector or the local level cop will look at you and just say, just log off, it's on the internet. Just block the other person if the person understands or bit of Facebook. Unfriend, friend. Something like that. You'll get some stupid yarn like that, right? So that's the thing. It is underlying social prejudice, power structures which are built. It is not the legal incapacity of the platforms. Now, yeah, I'm sounding like a shill for the platforms, right? I know I am, right? But go to all the UN reports on free expression and what roles the platforms have played. Shreya Singhal was one of the few cases where private industry, civil society, Shreya Singhal were all asking for the same relief. And that doesn't happen.
Running a bit short on time, so I think that's the last question.
Yeah. I think we can go off the other
Hello sir, I am Pradeep from the
Correct question.
So I have 2 questions, one from a policy standpoint and one from an enforcement of orders. So firstly, I want to ask you briefly hinted what rights under the current legal system do the intermediaries have to represent free speech issues before the court? Because you mentioned an instance where a judge had asked, why is the intermediary Google here? Why are the users there? So I wanted to ask you what you think is a sufficient legal answer in the current legal framework to say that yes, the intermediary has rights, derivative rights to defend free speech. And secondly, sir, you had talked about, you hinted at John Doe orders being issued by the courts and talked about the technical capabilities of various ISPs. My question is from a judicial standpoint. How do you think a judicial order should be narrowly tailored enough, or what do you think is the right judicial order to be issued in specific cases of film piracy, like it had happened with Mastan and a lot of other films?
So one question I have to ask was with respect to the digitization of the economy. Like I think today only in the newspaper it came that SBI and number of banks, they're looking at blockchains and all of that stuff. So my question was, and even Aadhaar having this Aadhaar payment system. So with respect to when you look at this field of law, on one hand you want the advancement of technology, you want, there is a lot of convenience present, but there's also the issue of privacy, wherein if there is a private body which doesn't want some particular viewpoint to be addressed, or the government doesn't want to have that viewpoint, that they can restrict such a viewpoint because they control the means of trade. So in this aspect, how does one actually make the public concerned? Because one of the main reasons people look into this field is because it's convenient. Like one of the biggest things is technology is convenient, so we'll use it. So when there is stuff like Paytm and Beam and things of that sort, how does one convince people that this need of privacy is also important?
Hi, I'm Gitanjali, and my question was more in terms of surveillance and monitoring in India. In the absence of something like a data protection directive and privacy laws in India, how do people, or how does one challenge something like the NAC grid or the CCTNS, the Central Monitoring System, and more recently the integrated people information hubs in the name of smart policing that has been implemented in Hyderabad and Telangana, which I think to an extent even our university has been subjected to. Like how does one challenge these in the light of the absence of privacy laws, and also considering that all of these schemes are in serious violation of the principle of least privilege?
Anybody else has questions?
Firstly, I wanted to know what is the extent and kind of tech you need to understand as a litigator in tech law. And secondly, I wanted to know about what kind of work you did at Google as a policy.
Career talk. Yeah. Okay, last question. Can we do one more round after this? Okay. May not be. Okay, we're tight on time, so let's.
Intermediaries and representative ability to sue film piracy and John Doe orders, financial tech and privacy, conveniences concerned, how do you utilize the public, surveillance and monitoring, and career and certainly on tech and policy. I'll try and do my quick thing. On intermediaries and representative ability, I think you can represent your users and you should sometimes indeed there. The point is very often than not there will be limits on what you can do. Especially, I'll just flag this for you. Most large intermediaries in this country that's changing are foreign companies and they've complicated parent/subsidiary relationships, so that's iffy. That said, they could still represent, the parent company could represent their users. I would flag they don't often always do that. Remember in the US they often actually just use the clear publisher exemption and the section 230, they don't even go into that. You can offer surveillance, and I know there's a lot of pressure today from my others to push them on surveillance. What they can do doesn't require them to go to a court, but they can send communications and notifications, very legal notices, saying how is this happening, this impacts our trust. So even if you can't represent your users, you can point out the trust and the harm you suffer and be able to establish locus standi. Now again, it's complicated, and Indian locus standi law, lack of law is a different topic, but it goes up and down. So I won't go into that in full detail. I'll take a bit of that offline. Apar can add in a bit. Film piracy and John Doe orders, actually I let Apar and can talk about that. I just wanted to mention on financial tech and privacy, and I think you talked about convenience. Also convenience is a concern. My position, I think apart from that is you need a referee. You need a data protection statute, preferably a comprehensive privacy law, which was being considered by the previous government and even this government. 11 versions, people, 8 versions at least I kept track of, none of which became public. It's a very private privacy law. They didn't make any of it public. One exact draft that was there, consultation. But we need that out there, we need a regulator. I mean, at least a DPA, a start of data protection authority in this country. On Kareem's concern, actually financial makes it even more important, and that's where Indians do understand. I recommend you read this privacy perception study published by IIIT Delhi by Ponurangam K. You will never remember that name, so go by P.K. IIIT D and the Precog research group there. He had 2 versions of it where he polled Indians and did perception study research, and he said, yes, Indians don't automatically understand the term privacy, but as they get A, well off, they do get it. B, they understand security and harm, and they understand harm due to financial sector information in particular. So that's very clearly there. I encourage you to read it because Indians do care about it. Look after demonetization, many MPs even from the heartland were asking questions. They're concerned about it. So I'd flag that. On NatGrid, smart regime monitoring, I let Apar maybe add in there, but there is a lot of stuff. And a lot of this is subject to what the Supreme Court is doing. You could again argue that legislatively you can also push for moves. The previous privacy bill drafts included oversight on some of these frameworks as well. It is for all of the people to ask the current ruling Indian government or others what's happening to that. I'll leave that there. I think the question on what sort of role tech to litigate is, I let Apar handle that. As a policy analyst at Google, I took everything. But in reality, obviously, you're tracking legislation, you're tracking regulatory developments. You're also trying to get people to understand tech at the basic level. That's not just in companies, even here, we often try and do that. Explain that to people. Obviously, also one big role you play in a company is you brief and advise internal staff, product people, business people, and others, saying that, by the way, besides me just defending you, if you did this, I would not have to defend you. Or this is how you can even engage or constructively provide inputs in the debate. There are many things I can talk about that offline with you.
So just a couple of things. One is on smart policing. Policing, I would say, Dr. Srinivas Kodali, the guy sitting over there, he's spent enough time studying the subject and is probably better informed than I am to talk about it. So it may end up being offline because I think we have a bunch of things to run through. In terms of how should blocking orders be issued, don't block things that are not part of the problem. Yeah? I mean, so if you block a torrent website, for instance, I just use a VPN and get the same torrent website. Right? It doesn't really solve the problem. And you're dealing with a publisher that's more informed with time and knows how to deal with this. Now, one of the things that the US Motion Picture Association of America did, it's not necessarily a move I agree with, but it's something they did, is that instead of blocking the websites, they would watch who was participating in the torrent network, and if it was an IP address that was known to be within the United States, they would go issue a suit to the ISP saying, identify this customer, they've been part of a Piracy Act, and we intend to now send them a legal notice. So they would get customer identification out of the ISP itself. But that did not involve blocking, it did not affect any other content. And the Indian approach, on the other hand, says instead of you chasing after an actual offender, you assume everybody else is guilty. This is a very problematic way to do it. So on that. In terms of how much technology should you know, I think the most important thing to understand is the institutional structures of technology decision making. One of the best ways to understand this is go look at a bug tracker for any open source project. If you look at anything that W3C does, anything that ICANN does, anything that any large open project does, they have an extremely public approach to discussing an issue. If you understand, for instance, how does the Chrome browser acquire its features? Everything that it acquires, whether it's Chrome or Firefox, is a very public bug tracker. For Chrome, you go to code.google.com. For Firefox, I think it's bugs.mozilla.org. So every issue that they discuss will be having an issue there, which will have a summary saying that this is how we want it to happen, this is what's currently happening, this is how it should be. So there is a case made saying something has to change for this reason. And then there is a fairly extensive debate saying what is the consequences of making this choice, who's affected by it, who's supposed to work on it. So it typically takes a very long time to get to the resolution, but that's perfectly okay because it becomes an extremely well-reasoned resolution at the end of it. And at some point, it also becomes a cross-project collaboration of this sort. So like, if two different browsers have two different ideas of how to do something, then clearly that's going to cause a problem for the web. So what you get then is that this kind of an issue then becomes something that W3C sets and says that they think that this is how it should work. Browser makers in turn participate in their bug tracker. They come to consensus over there. Then it comes down to each individual project saying, as per a collaborative decision, within our project, this is how we make these decisions. Ends up being that sometimes they become fights. If you look at, for instance, the do not track feature, the expectations of the do not track feature is that it is not enabled by default. Okay? This became a fight between Google and Mozilla, Google and Microsoft, because Microsoft decided that since they do not have an ad-driven business, they are going to enable it by default in Internet Explorer as a way to just hurt Google. And they claimed that this was good for users, so you should always enable this feature. Now what happened there is that this became a fight that a different party said, I will now add a feature to Apache server that says if you are using the Internet Explorer browser, ignore the do not track feature that is being requested by the browser because the browser sets up by default. Now this was a case of a bad collaborative effort that became a fight in two different projects entirely. Where one project says we ignore a particular request coming from a specific browser because we think the browser guys made a bad choice. So this is the politics of technology. With a large project like a browser, it is very easy for an outside observer to see how this is unfolding. So just watch that. Once you do that, you get a fair bit of insight of how it happens inside companies as well. Now, one of the unfortunate things in India is one of the most important technology projects sitting on right now is Aadhaar. And their bug tracker is private. You are not allowed to know how they went through their decision-making processes. One of the other things that's happening is NPCI with UPI. Their bug tracker is private. You have no idea how UPI arrived at, how NPCI arrived at decisions around UPI, who the collaborators were, what their arguments were, how did they decide that this was a better thing to do than that. These are kept secret from the public, which in my opinion is just bad for society. Nobody knows how these people made their decisions.
Given a correction, NPCI does not have any bug tracker. So they don't have one.
They don't even have one. So it's not like it's private, they don't even have one, yes. So, but at least watching international collaborations will help you understand how the overall tech ecosystem works, because one of the things that you live with is that you cannot do Indian technology that ignores worldwide standards. That is just not possible. We have seen this happen. It's turned out to be a scam. There was this thing called the Bharat Operating System BOSS, which was a fairly extensive scam that ran for almost a decade on government funding, promising to produce an operating system that would eliminate foreign dependency for India. Spent a lot of money, did absolutely nothing. Okay? So it is just not something that happens. You cannot say, I will ignore the rest of the world and build my own technology.
Was it to power the Akash tablet?
No, it was dead by the time Akash was conceived.
I have nothing more to add. I think my colleagues have covered a lot of issues today. But I would reiterate that, no, but even before that, I would just complete my sentence and say that we are on Twitter as Internet Freedom. We have a website, internetfreedom.in. You know our names. Our email addresses are first name
We're also on Facebook, right?
internetfreedom.in.
We're not on Facebook. We love
I'm
Facebook.
not on Facebook.
He's not, but IFF is there. I just also mentioned apart being a reference to Slack earlier. Slack is a communication and collaboration app. Some of you may have used, some of you may not have used. Especially for those who volunteer, we will in fact be actively encouraging them to join the general channel on the IFF site or along the IFF community, where they're often able to collaborate. But as Apar mentioned, we're fairly available and approachable. We're thinking of new ideas as well about how to work, so we're always open to that and don't hesitate. We're definitely happy to take more questions.
Yeah, and if people have told you you're useless your entire lives, don't take it seriously. We'll find something for you. You can make a meme, you can push out stuff. Really, I'm not kidding. You know, one of the biggest things about the Save the Internet campaign was, if you went on Reddit, you could see a complete stream of content just being created by a community. You can be part of that community.
So, I have a story. So there's a jurisprudence professor and a colleague of ours named Anil, who once was very unhappy with my batch at MLS, and he said, would you like, I don't know what you people will do, maybe you will end up being documentary filmmakers. And after the AIB video released, and people said 1.2 million comments and law and policy has been determined by that, I said, documentary filmmakers do have an impact, maybe that is not. It's just it's like a lighter note, but seriously, any small thing makes a difference. The idea is just to be willing to engage publicly in processes. Don't assume people aren't willing to do that. Even if someone is opposed to your viewpoint, they'll often be willing to talk. And the thing with policymakers really is that, they have limited time. They often have competing interests, but they're willing to listen. even in our sometimes flaky democracy.
So they actually have a flight to catch. We can take a last round of comments, but not enough time for answers. That you can talk to them directly. Right?
Kiran's still here.
If you want to say something, yeah. If you want to say something, you can say it now. That's what I mean.
I just want to add, like, we should probably also focus on neutrality outside the internet. So, a reference to Hyderabad is that we are now starting to have Uber driver suicides. So that's because of the Uber's neutrality policy.
So it's probably something all of you as well. So as we are moving forward with post-demonetization, the age of big data, one thing which is critical is algorithmic bias, right? So I don't think anybody in Indian courts would probably even understand the extent of it, because algorithms in first place are not open. You cannot measure bias unless you know what the algorithm is. So it's a tricky situation where tech and law meets here in this particular space. How can you even stop an act of bias under the Articles 14 and 15 of the Constitution?
And I want to break Siddharth's answer just to mention, great example, in the US, your credit history is accessible as an algorithm. It's accessible due to law, because states have passed laws saying that you can access that. This is a fun fact I heard from ProPublica reporter, but just to bridge the thing there. See, this is the scope of what you can do.
I mean, the idea is if you can't measure the bias with data, then
yes. So we, as he was mentioning, there are 4 such laws in the US, not just the credit bill, the others related to data. We don't have any of them in India. It's just not about privacy of data. It's also about data affecting somebody, and under the constitutional rights, the Constitution is even granting you. This is something which the younger audience should ideally perceive, and I look forward from the lawyer's perspective. And I don't have any law background, but I know the issue.
We would want our perspective to matter, as technicians would want their perspective to matter as in law. That's the first challenge which Kiran identified.
Yeah, and the law is anyway a fake discipline. So.
that's what IndiaStack guys say.
Do you think public consultation is a good way to generate support for civil liberties related to tech matters? Because most of the signatures you might have gotten the people would not even have understood the issues properly. So in a country like India, we are holding the discourse now, we are controlling the discourse now, so it's fine, but there are lots of other actors who can control the discourse against people's interests. So do you think public consultation would be a way to go?
I think it's democratic. You need to give people a chance, right? And let it roll with it. You'll get a Barack Obama, you'll get a Donald Trump, but you have to be democratic.
Consultation with a constitutional backstop.
Yeah.
That's the reminder to us. Okay. That's the thing.
Any other comment? Or there's one hand there. Amrita, very quickly.
Sorry, just a small clarification with respect to the doctrine of autoblog, which was just used to block the prenatal sex determination search results. I was just wondering how this was differentiated from prior restraint, especially in the light of presidents such as Rajagopal as the state of EM.
It's not. The court does not deem it to be meritorious enough for a comment.
It's an order also.
Because it's precedent, and precedent does not control this court.
With my limited comment, I mentioned that this is an order here, it's not a judgment, so maybe it will change, but probably won't.
Or the case will drag on for 3 years.
And that's one more dangerous thing we forget. In India, a lot of laws made by orders, it's not by the final judgment. It's an awful practice. I particularly really have an issue with our Supreme Court for doing this, with 31 judges and no one knowing what's going on. But it's a particular thing that as students I flag that you'll often miss. So that's one reason I encourage people to read orders and check that what's there, because we may scoff at press reporting by the way 2 things. A, the press often get things right. B, what the press sends out is a network signal to policymakers. So on Aadhaar, I can tell you, it's when the press has reported stuff in a particular way, or being true to the order, or being hostile or whatever, that we've seen government and others say, okay, we can do this. Because that's what they read. Because until they know that, or until they get a contempt notice, they don't care.
So, we're running short on time, so we'll end it with that. Thank you, sirs, for taking the time from your sharing.
Thank you, Karthik. Thank you, Arun. Where's Arun? Still here? Okay. Thank you for having us here.
Thank you for bearing with us and all the grief we gave you over the flights, all of it. No, thank you so much. This has been wonderfully organized. Thank you all for waking up on a weekend so early. I've been told that 11 a.m. is considered early in this campus. My colleague Kiran will be staying back. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have a bunch of stickers.